As some of you may have seen, there has recently been the white paper report.
There's various points in there. Obviously, the devil's always going to be in the detail as well. And we were discussing, off the recording as well, about how there's probably going to be loopholes created, and it's probably going to take them 3 to 6 months to shut down a lot of those loopholes as well.
But I think the more you read into it and actually look at it, it is actually, in my mind anyway, a really balanced report.
Yeah.
What was your thought on the changes to the Section 21 notice? Hi, and welcome back to another conversation with myself, Kaz from Property by Kazy. Today we're here to do something slightly different. As some of you may have seen, there has recently been the white paper report, which is effectively some of the largest changes to social housing in recent years. And we're just going to come and discuss some of the issues that have come up, the pros and cons between the report that's been outlined, and to see what you guys think of it as well. Today I'm joined by
Saif from SDGB Properties.
Exactly, so we're going to have Saif on one of our podcasts coming out soon. His details will be in the description below, so make sure you catch up with him to see all of the amazing stuff that he's up to. Again, there's going to be loads more information about you in that podcast, but we're not here to talk about you today. We're here to talk about some of the reforms in the private rental sector. I don't know how much any of you have read about it, but typically there's always been almost like that landlords sit on this side, tenants sit on that side, and there's been a disbalance of power between the two. And effectively, that's been one of the main focuses of the report, to effectively readdress that balance of power between tenants and landlords and find a system and and legislation that works for all parties involved.
Yeah. So I think it's levelling up, certainly, and they're trying to find a balance now. And I think the other thing you got to remember, this is quite a political move as well. We don't want to go into politics, but it is quite a political move because elections are coming up soon, etc. And a large part of the UK population is made up of renters. So I think they want to be seen as trying to be a bit fairer. And obviously this is where the white paper is kicked in. So there's various points in there. Obviously the devil's always going to be in the detail as well. And we were discussing, off the recording as well, about how there's probably going to be loopholes created, and it's probably going to take them 3 to 6 months to shut down a lot of those loopholes as well. So naturally, as you get with a lot of this stuff, it's going to allow people to be able to do stuff around the actual law itself. But I think, should we start with Section 21, because that's the biggest one in everyone's
That's the biggest one. I
process.
think the thing is, at the moment, obviously it's a suggestion effectively of where the private rental sector should go, where the requirements should move. But a lot of the time when something like this does come out, humans, we're naturally against change. It doesn't matter for good or for bad. Sometimes we hear change and we run for the hills. And I think that's almost was my first impression when I saw it. The headlines were, no more non-fault evictions, abolish Section 21, which as a landlord you think, hang on a second, you're telling me I now don't have the responsibility and the control over my own asset. But I think the more you read into it and actually look at it, it is actually, in my mind anyway, a really balanced report. What was your thought on the changes to the Section 21 notice?
I mean, I think that the whole point of it is, and there's going to be winners and losers naturally, but I think the whole point is they're trying to get away from people making effectively people homeless or getting them out of the property within a reasonable time frame for really no reason of their own. So the whole point of that Section 21 is usually, I think, I can't remember the exact stat on it, but I think 50 to 60% of people that sell their homes or whatever use Section 21, or people that want to go and move back into their homes as well. So I think the whole point of it is if you're renting the property, you've abided by all of the terms and conditions in your AST, which is your short hold tenancy agreement, you pay your rent on time, you're a great tenant, you look after the property. Why are you a victim of being told to leave your home, which you've created as your home, you think of as your home? Because we need to play devil's advocate here, right? So it's preventing people from being able to feel like it's their home, and they're always feeling like there's a sense of insecurity. And I've seen it because my brother, he was renting for a set period of time, and he really struggled to find something. And every time he found something, the landlord would want to move back into it because he was renting the kind of properties that it was a first-time landlord, for example, accidental landlord that used to live in it, moved away, rented it. And it's quite difficult to find good quality accommodation where you can call home for a long term is quite difficult. So they're trying to move away from that, and they're trying to do this whole big blanket of no Section 21s, only Section 8s, which is basically if there's a breach of the contract or the tenancy agreement.
I think the thing about it is that we're talking about somebody renting a property and viewing it as their home, and somebody who owns the property. And as much as it is somebody's home, it's still their asset.
Yeah.
And there's that crossover, because is it an asset or is it a home? And if I own an asset, there's an argument that I should be in control of how I want to use said asset. So, even if somebody's a great tenant, what if in recent instances, for example, what if you're managing the property as a HMO with bills included? So you had a load of tenants, paying the bills, but because of increased fuel prices, utility prices, that no longer was a viable option. And therefore you wanted to turn it back into a family home. Now, those same renters wouldn't necessarily be the people that wanted to rent it out as a single family dwelling.
Yeah.
So I think there is, consideration. I think there does need to make sure that it does protect the landlords in the same way it protects the rentals at the same time.
No, I agree. And I think that the reality of, if you look at if you surveyed 1,000, let's say tenants, for example, and it could be the best quality tenants in the world, at some point they would have breached their agreement in some way, shape or form. It could be the smallest little thing ever, but they would have breached their agreement. So technically, under the Section 8, you could probably use it at various points. Now, they probably don't even realise that, and probably landlords don't even realise that they've breached the agreement, right? But the point is, Section 21 as a general just is not working out from a tenant's perspective. However, from a landlord's perspective, they need that level of control. I think we're going to get to a point where maybe Section 8 covers a few more things. So it's not just breach of tenancy, but there should be a few more things added to Section 8, and it becomes one section rather than being able to use Section 8, Section 21. And really Section 21 is, everyone's heard the story of Fergus is it Ferguson, or I forgot his name anyway, one of the biggest landlords in Kent. He just get all of his tenants out when he just feels like it. He wants to get the properties re-rented out for hire. He wants to sell them. He wants to do this, that and the other. And he just wasn't treating his tenants in the right way.
So you mentioned just that, potentially evicting tenants when they weren't willing to pay, the increased rental amounts.
Yeah.
Do you think it should be standardized then in terms of a maximum cap on how much you can increase rents by? Do you think there should be a process when it comes to rental increase? Because if effectively, your reason for potentially serving somebody notice is they don't agree to your proposed new rental increase, where do you go from there?
It's a good point. We've, over the last couple of months or so, we bought more properties that are tenanted than we've ever bought. And that's come with its own complexities, because we bought properties that are under rented, you've got no deposit, no guarantor, which is not our norm. We wouldn't do that. And we found that it's way more challenging having to deal with those tenants rather than if it was an empty property, we refurbed it, put our own tenants in. That's the easiest part. But it just so happens that that's what we had on the table in terms of properties. So we found anyway that when we bought it, so we obviously served generally the Section 48s, just to say this is a new landlord. We then look at serving a Section 13, which is the rent increase. And I'd probably say 9 times out of 10, the tenants haven't had a rent increase for the last 10, 15 years. So they're like, why is my rent increasing? It's quite a large increase. And the problem is a lot of tenants have had it so good because they've had previous landlords that have not increased their rent for such a long time. It makes that gap too wide for us to be able to go now and try and increase the rent. So the reality is, I do think a cap, but a regular cap is much better than just basically saying, I'm going to go from this to this. But it should be done consistently, because if it's done consistently, so if it's, let's just say 5 to 10% on average a year, just for example, over a 10-year period, that rent would have doubled. And that's fair. But to go from 1 year to 10 years and double in 1 year, it's just too much. People can't comprehend it. And I think also naturally, as the rent starts to increase, if people feel like they're not going to be able to afford it next year or the year after, they'll start to look elsewhere and start to look to go to another property. Whereas if you do the rent increase in one go, it doesn't give them enough time to find something else. So I think for me, yes, it would be good, but if it was done in a very consistent manner across the board, because rents are going up at the minute,
Exactly. I think collectively, when I looked at the report, one thing that I liked about it was creating an era for landlords and for tenants, standardization of minimum standard requirements across the board, across renting in the UK. Now, what that means is we have expectations for landlords. So the expectations are increasing, and for good reason. I think now this experience as a tenant is like a customer service experience, i.e. that to a degree, not that the customer maybe is always right, but you are there to serve your tenant because they're paying the money to live in a property and should expect that property to be of a certain standard, have repairs to be done in a reasonable time frame, to have proper communication, and to meet all of the obligations and the legislation involved in renting a property. Which I think that standardization that this potentially brings in even more so is really good. I think it's becoming the case a lot more with build to rent accommodation, where the big players are coming in, they're having in-house management teams, maintenance teams, which means the level of customer service delivered to renters is a lot higher. So people are getting used to that and expecting that from your accidental private landlords that you mentioned before. So I think that's good. I think the thing with increased legislation is that for the people that are already doing it, it's not going to worry them. For the good landlords, it's not going to worry them. And it potentially is going to scare off some of the bad landlords, which is also a good thing in my mind.
Yeah, and I think, look, when you look over the last 10 years for landlords, it's been quite brutal. In all honesty, there's been so many different legislative changes over the last 10 years. And in that, it served its purpose. The government, Section 24 abolishment, where basically they pushed everyone into limited companies, was the start of it. And part of that is also EPC changes and everything else we're getting, EICR, gas safety, etc. So everything that we've got now in terms of legislative changes anyway is pushing out the small-time landlord that has 1 or 2 or 3 properties that might be accidental, also pushing out the rogue landlords, and very much what it's doing from the beginning, the agenda has always been institutionalizing landlords. So landlords need to be very institutionalized, they need to be very process-driven, very systems-driven, and they need to be at a relative size where it makes sense to keep up with the legislation. Because if I had only 5 properties, I'd just be like, I can't be bothered. I've got a full-time job or I've got a full-time business. I don't really want to be doing this all the time.
I think that's where the thing is though, as much as you say that, even if you've only got 1 property, if it's standardized and it's easy, so that's the other thing. They said they wanted to create like a landlord's portal that made it really easy to understand your obligations. Because as a landlord that's got 1 property, the level of administration that goes into owning that 1 property and staying up to date can be really time consuming, taxing and daunting for some landlords. But if they can make it as simplistic as possible, because I think the property industry as a whole, whether that's from buying to selling to renting, is pretty archaic in terms of how long it takes to do everything and have everything checked. So I think if the government can introduce legislation that brings it into the modern era and makes it more streamlined, makes the processes easier to follow, I think it will be a lot more helpful for those smaller landlords as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think that what you said is absolutely right. If you have 1 property or 100 properties, you're still using the same net time to understand all the legislative changes and try and keep up to date with it. So you get economies of scale at 100. So if they can do this hybrid portal between landlords and between obviously the tenants, I think it's going to massively, massively help. The other problem that you've got is a lot of the time is you've got the council or shelter, whoever it is, getting involved. And the majority of the time, this is where you see stay in your home until the bailiffs come, the classic one. You've been served the Section 21, served Section 8, do not leave, because they don't want to take on that headache. They're trying to kick the can down the road as far as possible, and they're not responsible for when that tenant has a CCJ against their name, they can't find another property. They're going to come back to the council, I guarantee you. They can only go back to the council, but they're literally almost creating
a catch-22.
Well, it's a catch-22, and also it's a system that is made for the tenants. The tenants are going to fail, basically. They're making the tenants fail on purpose because of that. And I think this is going to change where you've got a lot more education. This is going to be an education piece, right? Which is tenants will be well more educated than they are currently, but at the same time, it makes it easier for that communication between the landlords and the tenants. And I think that way you take out all the friction with, I've been to the council, they've said to do this, or I've been to shelter, they said to do that, with, right, I'm speaking to the landlord directly or to the agent, whoever it is, and actually we're being quite amicable. Because 9 times out of 10, what you'll find, and I've done this myself, I've gone on, we've had properties in rent arrears or properties where the tenant isn't responding, whatever it is, I've gone and knocked on the door myself. And 9 times out of 10, I've solved that just by having a conversation. And it's like, well, my previous landlord didn't sort the boiler out and I've been without hot water for 3 months. Right. If I get a plumber out tomorrow, would you pay your rent? Yeah, of course I will. But it's burying their head in the sand because you're not listening to them, or generally they feel like they're not getting listened to. So I think the point is, if there's a better line of communication,
and I think when it comes to the communication, I think there's a lot of misinformation. So i.e., you know, a landlord thinks, well, I don't have to fix a boiler. I'll fix it when my plumber's available. And he says, I'm not available for 2 weeks. But actually, if there is really black and white, okay, so these types of repairs have to be done within this time frame. Yeah. This type of repairs has to be done with this time frame. You need to respond to like emails. If there's very clear requirements from both tenants and landlords, it makes accountability less of a grey area. And I think it's that ambiguity of accountability that often leads people to go into court. Well, I think it's your fault. I think it's your fault. And it's not productive for either party, because if the end goal is to make sure that everybody is as productive and can enjoy their own time in their own homes as much as possible, you know, having to go through litigation isn't going to be helpful for anybody.
Yeah, I agree. And it's just a waste of resource and time in reality. I think you're absolutely right. I think if everything is more defined with the time frame, so you've got a time frame and everything is very much defined, so it is black and white, it's going to make everything so much better. Any grey areas really need to be abolished. And I think, to be fair, the white paper, from reading it, is going to be abolishing a lot of the grey areas, which is ideally what everyone wants, right?
I think, and that's generally like when it first came out, and someone said, "Oh, can you come?" I think they asked me to come and talk on a show in favour of it, and I looked at the headlines and I saw, no more evictions, you can't do this. I thought, it's just another nail in the coffin for the private landlord. But in actually taking the time to look at it, I think for the good landlords, it's actually going to be a blessing in disguise, in that there's a lot of opportunities for just transparency and ease of things that are now being that everybody has to do, that you were doing before as a good landlord, you know, anyway. Before we get on to the next part of this conversation, I think we actually have to talk about where we are. So we're at your, can I call this your clubhouse?
It's a subscription that I'm part of, so it's part of the clubhouse.
So part of the clubhouse that you're part of, and what's it called?
So it's called Autovivendi.
And so I think for those of you who haven't noticed, we have a very aesthetically pleasing backdrop, particularly for your petrol heads. So we might tune out from some of the property people right now, but obviously this is a car club, effectively.
Yeah, it is. And I think this is the way the world is going now. People want to feel like they're part of a club. So like you go to Oxford or Cambridge for a university to have the network, not necessarily for the education, this is another thing where you can network with people and find people. For me, funny enough, I found a lot of people outside the property, it's just a different perspective. So lots of business owners, lots of high net worth. There is a few people in property that are part of the club as well. So being part of the club is not only having access to the cars. Having access to the cars is one thing. Being able to come into, you've got a boardroom that you can use, in the middle of London. You've also got a really good network of people. They do events all the time. So
where did you just come back from?
Just came back from Croatia as well. So they did a 1 week tour around Croatia. I think it was 850-mile tour down the coastline as well.
What car did you take to Croatia?
There was 10 cars and we drove every single one of them.
Okay, nice.
So they took out 10 of their best cars and we drove every single one of them.
What was your favourite drive over there?
I'd probably say my favourite drive was the McLaren 620R, which is the one that you can see over there.
Okay.
I probably would not drive that in the UK, but over there with the windy roads, it was absolutely brilliant. It gripped really well. Nice.
And what else have we got? Because I'm the guy that, if I was to tell you what cars you currently got here, it would be the black one, the blue one, and the grey one, and that's about the extent of what I know. So what's this lovely blue one?
So we've got a Maserati MC20, which is one of the new Maseratis that's come out. It's come off the back of the MC12. So the MC12 is the race car, and they thought, let's bring out a supercar, so that's brilliant. You've got the McLaren 600 LT, which is what I call the Batmobile, right at the back, it's the black one. You've got a Ferrari 812 Superfast, which is that one there, and it's a very, very fast car. That's a lovely, lovely car to drive. The McLaren 620R, which is the one that we just talked about, that's a track car, so that's perfect for a track. It is road legal as well, so you can use it on the road. We've got the Rolls-Royce Wraith as well, which is just do you know what? Talking about property, I got invited to a black tie event in London with one of my local estate agents that I do loads of business with, and we took that car out, and it was just, it just changes the whole dynamic, and it allows you to be able to do stuff, events and stuff like that as well. So that's why I like being part of this club, which is great.
Whereabouts are we? Where are we based?
We're in St John's Wood.
St John's Wood. So for anybody that's looking at potentially joining a car club or just wants to find out a little bit more what it's about, the link will be in the description below, and it is Autovivendi?
Yeah, Autovivendi.
Or AVV.
Yeah, AVV.
AVV for me to remember it easier. Brand new series with myself, Kaz from Property by Kazy, bringing together some of the best developers and development projects across the UK.
This is probably my favourite flat because of the challenges.
This property was purchased for approximately 980,000.
So we're now in the hallway of flat number 9.
We should be generating £4,250 per calendar month.
Yeah, we did a full rewire, full replumb, the boiler's over your shoulder, all the copper was gone.
You've got the flip deals, BRRR, ground up construction, new build houses, conversions, office to residential, you name it, we're gonna go and see it. So if you wanna see some of the best developments in the UK, subscribe right now. But you know me, I'm not here to talk about all these cars because for me, like I said, it is blue, black, and as you know, the Kazy orange, which is what I find most important, but I want to get back to property. So as much as I've said today, you know, I don't have a massive issue with a lot of things in the report. When you look at the comment sections of the big landlord communities, whether that be Landlord Zone or the likes, there are a lot of people that are really up in arms and they feel like, you know, it's an imbalance. That it's like, you know, another nail in the private landlord coffin. People are saying that I'm going to be selling up because they think it's imbalanced. Like one thing is, what do you feel about saying you should be allowed a pet in pretty much any...
This is an interesting one. So for us, historically, what we've looked at is any time that there's something outside of the norm, we felt that it created an extra barrier to prevent the tenant from leaving. So for us, the longer the tenant stay, the better for us, because obviously these are all long-term investments. And yeah, majority of our stuff is single-family homes, whereas I know other people do HMOs, so it's slightly different. But let's just say on the single-family home level, right? Put HMOs to the side. I feel personally that we took on more tenants with pets than anyone else. And the reason we did that was it was so difficult to find a property that would take tenants with pets that it made them stay for the long term. Now, when you bring in HMOs, that adds another layer of complexity. It does get quite difficult. So we've accepted some, you know, in some of our HMOs, mainly student ones, some tenants with pets, and it's created too many issues. Now, what we do specifically, just as for everyone to understand, is when we took on a tenant with a pet previously, we charge what's called 7.5% pet memorandum fee. So we got them to sign a pet memorandum fee, which basically meant that although we couldn't take more deposit, it was 5 weeks cap, but they were still responsible for the extra wear and tear of the pet, plus they would pay 7.5% extra on their rent. So for us, it was a way of maximising the rent, but saying these group of tenants that feel excluded are actually welcome for us. We did the same thing with DSS as well. So for me, it's again just levelling the playing field out again. So for us, I guess it's not really great because it means we lose that
niche or that USP.
That niche, but I still feel like, you know, we're talking about basically, you know, realistically, you know, people finding loopholes. There's going to be a loophole somewhere, and essentially people, even though they won't advertise that they won't accept pets, they won't pass maybe the referencing or whatever it is. So theoretically, it's not going to change much because people can still say, unfortunately, you haven't passed this or you haven't passed that, even though the real reason is you've got pets and that's why we don't want to take you on.
Yeah, I think, like you said, you found a system that worked for you to allow pets, and you just, you sort of systemized in a way that made sure that it made sense for you and made sense for the tenant. And I think a lot of people look at, it's my house, I don't want a pet. But what if it's, you know, the example of you've got a large house with a large garden with, you know, a very low maintenance pet. There's not really much rationale behind, well, it's mine and I don't want to. And I think the move that, you know, this reform is trying to make is that for it to not just be deemed as your house, like yes, it's your asset, but it's the renter's home, and to allow for a degree of flexibility. Another issue that when I've spoken to other landlords that are really against it is they feel that there's an element of disparity or an imbalance between what the requirements are for the landlords and what the requirements are for the tenants. So i.e. there's going to be a bad landlord register for the people that are registered with the redress schemes, that you will be registered as a bad landlord if you don't fail to meet the requirements of the tenancy or as the requirements of a landlord. However, there isn't the same in place as a bad tenants register. Do you think that there is still an element of imbalance in what's being proposed?
Yeah, I think there is, and I think whatever happens when there is an imbalance over time, that will be balanced out again. Because if you have loads of landlords leaving the sector, just for example, as a result of an imbalance, what's going to happen is less properties in the rental sector, rents are going to go up, the renters are going to complain that you're driving landlords away, and then everything balances out again. So effectively, anything that feels imbalanced is going to balance out again. Do I feel like this specific point might cause an imbalance? Most likely. I think this is why I always say to people, if you do have a tenant that's been a problematic tenant, i.e. hasn't paid the rent or created some kind of situation that has cost you money, put the CCJ in. You know, most people are too late, most landlords are too lazy, they don't want to do it. It's an extra step. It's like, oh, they've left, I'll just write the debt off. The point is it's principle, because you're ruining it for other landlords that essentially will end up taking them on. Because if they saw the CCJ in place because it's a lack of rent payment or maybe damage to the property or whatever, you're not going to take them on, no one else is going to take them on. And I think if you're not doing that and landlords sticking together and saying, as a matter of principle, we're going to put an M-Call in, try and get a CCJ against a tenant, then how are we ever going to come to a point where it is a level playing field? Because we can say, genuinely, anyone that's been referenced, anyone that's got a guarantor is a great tenant. We can't say that now because there might be certain CCJs not showing up. And people are just, it's a continuous cycle of that tenant's moving from one landlord to the other and just causing so much havoc along the way. Someone just puts their foot down.
Accountability for all parties
Accountability.
involved.
But if you can put that into an easy register or something like that and take away the hassle from the landlords from having to go down that route and the cost as well, don't forget, you know, there's a cost to put an M-Call in, then I think that's going to allow letting agents, landlords to say, do you know what? We know that 99% this tenant's going to be great because they're not on that register or whatever it is. You can't generalise, but you know, 99% of the time you're going to be right if you're looking at stuff like that.
So you touched on it briefly, but what do you think, if any, impact this is going to have on the, you know, on the housing market, or i.e. the private landlord market, private rental market? Do you think it's going to be something that's going to make landlords shy away? You've heard people saying, well, I'm going to sell up. What impact do you think it's going to have, if any?
But it's going to have the same impact that it's currently been having anyway. So this is just part of a bigger piece of what the government has already been playing out for the last 10 years, right? And that's literally a case of drive out all of the old school landlords, drive out all of the rogue landlords, and drive out all the accidental landlords. The agenda's been going on for nearly 10 years now. And all this is going to do is just accelerate that trend. So what will happen is those people will end up selling up their houses in terms of landlords. The people that we buy in them could be owner-occupiers or it could be investors, but it's institutionalising. The investor side of things is becoming more institutionalised at the minute. So I'll give you an example, because obviously we've got the cash buying company, we get contacted by lots of different companies. One company that contacted us, they literally went out and raised £80 million from a pension fund, and they're literally going out and buying £8 million or £8 million, I think it's £8 million worth of property on a monthly basis. And it's the exact same properties that we would be buying. Terrace houses or semi-detached houses, suburban locations, 100 to 200 grand type houses, maybe a touch more. So then we're now competing, not just against other landlords, but against institutions that are raising hundreds of millions of pounds, you know, nationwide basically and worldwide. So the point is on that, that's becoming more prominent. You can see the institutionalization, you know, the institutions coming into this market. But also what it's going to create is if that property then goes to an owner-occupier, there's one less property in the rental market. There's one less property for the renters to choose from, i.e. supply and demand. Rents go up because supply comes down. Just to add into the complexity, as of today, inflation's at a real high. Yeah, we've got the stocks and shares market down, the crypto market down. So if you're a 60 to 65-year-old landlord that's owned 15, 20 properties over the time and you're looking to sell up, what do you do with that money? Because if you put that money in the bank, you're losing 9 to 10%.
And the weird thing is, if you put it in a pension fund, they're putting it back into property.
Well, that's the point. And also, if they're not doing that, they're putting it into stocks and shares, which is down. So because at the minute, you've really limited options. If inflation wasn't in the picture, forget about stocks and shares and crypto, you put that money in the bank, that's fine. But add into that complexity COVID and cruise ships being down, holidays in general being down, people not spending money. If you can't spend your money, if you can't put it in the bank, you can't put it in stocks and shares, you keep it in property. Hence why we've not had loads of properties coming into the market, because landlords are saying, let's keep hold of them. And
that's the thing. So I think that's a really good sort of holistic answer to what potentially could happen. I think there's loads of different arguments, like, you know, off the back of supply and demand. Is a landlord just going to get tired and say it's one lash too many and I'm giving up, I'm throwing in the towel? But I think the other side of it is, as much as there is increased legislation, is increased administration and costs for landlords, be that through changes in taxation and other changes in requirements, rents are going up. Rents are going up starkly. I've had, you know, some of the most drastic rent increases across the board over the last 18 months. There is an undersupply of housing. The government have failed to meet, housing sort of quotas of new builds of homes. So population is increasing, the housing market unfortunately isn't being able to keep up with that. So as you mentioned, supply and demand, that as those rents go up, it becomes a more attractive investment. It's sort of chicken and egg in which way it goes. And I think it will sort of, there is going to be a little bit of fluctuation, but I think over time, when you look at the market outwardly, it's going to increase and, stay quite buoyant, which I think is really interesting. But it's just the overall conversation in regards to, where is the market going? What impact is this going to have? And you touched on all these other things that are happening outside of just this report, i.e. the impact of COVID and the spending, potentially austerity measures that are coming in, crises in terms of international crises, be that with Russia and Ukraine and other stuff happening as well, that I think it's, for want of a better word, a really interesting time.
Yeah.
But in a time where markets are moving, I think it's always an opportunity as well.
Yeah, you've got to adapt. I mean, look at what happened in March 2020. March 2020, I remember this very, very vividly, but at the end of March 2020, I was getting phone calls from estate agents saying, those properties that you offered on that you didn't get, they've all come back, basically. It's like Armageddon down in London. Everyone thought it literally was the end of the world, for a lot of people, from the economic point of view, from even from a health point of view. So that really sent shockwaves. But the reality was, it was about being consistent, adapting, and I think that's the real key, is how do you adapt, basically. And just basically just trying to, it's proper, I'd say, logistics management, and somewhat within COVID crisis management as well. But just looking at things from a long-term point of view, it's that whole old age saying, if you're in doubt, zoom out and look at the long-term property. Yes, you have these little niggly bits that you need to sort out in the meantime. Yes, you have to read load of legislative pieces and stuff like that and understand it and get to terms with it. But over the long term, it's going to create so much equity and so much wealth for you that it's worth doing. So I think risk reward is always going to play out, and I think for me the reward is always greater than the risk, personally. Anyway, that's how I see things.
That's it. Well, I think this has been another great conversation. We are today down at AVV Home and a Supercar. I'm Kaz from Property by Kazy, joined by
Saif from SDGB Properties.
Again, that's our say on the matter, but we want to hear what you have to say. So if you do have a comment or anything that we've said today, let us know in the comments. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, and we'll be back next week with some more property news.